Good day. The last week has witnessed one of the most bizarre periods in international diplomacy which I can remember, and provides further proof of the extraordinary dysfunctionality of the Biden-Harris administration. Let's review what has happened. Firstly, we had that telephone conversation which came out of the blue between President Biden of the United States and President Putin of Russia. I discussed that in a recent program that I did for this channel, in which I pointed out that Biden seems to be trying to put relations with Russia on an even keel, and that his overriding priority seemed to be to try to avoid a conflict in eastern Ukraine, which Ukraine seemed to be provoking by moving its troops to the contact line between itself and the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, which, in light of the huge military buildup that Russia is undertaking on Ukraine's border, would result in Ukraine's comprehensive defeat and quite possibly the destruction of Ukraine. Then we received reports that the United States had decided to withdraw its two Arleigh destroyers, which were heading for the Black Sea. Now, when I discussed this in my last video, this was not yet fully confirmed, but it has now been confirmed by the US government, indeed by President Biden himself. Indeed, the US has confirmed that it has decided to withdraw these two destroyers from the Black Sea as a de-escalation measure and in order to calm Russia. Now, I have to make, again, a few quick observations about this singular move. Firstly, we were told a few weeks ago by CNN, on the basis of US administration sources, US government sources, that the US would send its fleet into the Black Sea to carry out a show of force there in support of Ukraine, which was finding itself under severe pressure from the Russian buildup. Now, that was always nonsense. The timing of a request to transfer ships to the Black Sea, a request that must, under the Montreux Convention, be made to the Turkish government. The timing of that request is 15 days, and if one takes it further back, if one traces back to that period of time, that request must have been made before the Russian deployments began. In other words, the movement of those ships makes more sense in the context of the Ukrainian buildup on the contact line, rather than the Russian buildup, which has taken place in response to it. Then the United States denied that the ships were actually heading to the Black Sea, or at least this is what was being reported, specifically by Fox News. And the US government was saying that all reports that those ships were in fact sailing to the Black Sea was Russian disinformation. Well, that was clearly absurd. And over the course of the next few hours, the story has changed again. It's no longer Russian disinformation that the ships were going to the Black Sea. It's accepted that that was the case. But now it's being presented as a de-escalation move, not to annoy and alarm Russia. In fact, far and away the most likely explanation for this decision to turn the ships back has been Russian threats, specifically a verbal threat from Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov that if those two warships came too close to the Russian coast, it might not be good for their health, and information that Russia has been redeploying a powerful strike force of Sukhoi 34 strike bombers, which with the powerful missile armaments they possess, be in a position to strike those two destroyers wherever they were in the Black Sea. I would add that Russia, of course, does have a Black Sea fleet. Its surface component is not the ships of its surface component are not individually comparable to either of the two Arleigh Burke deployers the U.S. Navy was deploying, but it does have a substantial and very modern submarine force in the Black Sea. And of course, it has enormous aviation assets. And in addition, it has very powerful and extremely advanced anti-ship supersonic missiles of the Bastion and Val designation, which would in fact provide an overwhelming threat to any US warships that became drawn into a hot war in the Black Sea. I would add that in the hours after the US announcement that it was withdrawing its warships from, or rather would not deploy its warships in the Black Sea, articles began to appear in the British press that the Russians have declared a zone near their coast, which includes the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait, which they say is forbidden territory for warships of foreign powers to enter. So it may very well be that the Russians communicated to the United States that this move was coming, and that this action by the Russians, together with the renewed deployments of Russian fighter bombers, was what caused the United States to turn its ships round. Anyway, so much for that. Then, a few hours later, we got a telephone conversation by President Biden of the United States to President Putin. This is, of course, the telephone conversation that I discussed in my recent program. In it, President Biden seemed to make scant allusions, if you were to if you were to read the two readouts, to the situation in Ukraine. He spoke with Putin about all kinds of issues of mutual interest, arms control, the New START treaty, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Iran, whatever. And he invited Putin to a summit in a third country, which should take place over the course of the next few weeks, possibly over the course of the summer. Then this telephone conversation, by the way, happened along the same time as the US intelligence community published its intelligence community assessment of the state of the threats to the United States. And that assessment contains a very interesting single line about Russia. I mean, most of the comments about Russia are entirely predictable, but there is one line in it which says that the Russians are not looking for a conflict with the United States. They do not want the United States to interfere in their domestic policy. In return, they will not interfere in US domestic policy if the US leaves them alone. And they also want a sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union. Now, that, on the face of it, suggests a rather conciliatory position and might, by some people, appear to be a fairly realistic appraisal of Russian policy. I'm going to make a guess that the person who inserted that sentence into the intelligence community assessment is the new CIA director, William Burns, who was formerly the US's ambassador to Russia, and who therefore has some experience of Russia and some knowledge of the Russian leadership. And he has openly confirmed that he was told by the Russians that the NATO and that NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia would be for Russia a red line, and he is known to be someone, or is believed to be someone, with a fairly realistic view of policy towards Russia, who wants to achieve a rapprochement with Russia, or at least, if not exactly a rapprochement, at least a de-escalation of the tense relationship that that has been the hallmark of US-Russian relations for, well over a decade now, before, by the way, the Ukrainian crisis began, at least as far back as the time when Vladimir Putin first became president of Russia back in 2000. And then, a few hours after these seemingly conciliatory moves from the United States, we then had the announcement of sanctions by the United States against Russia. Now, I have expressed some bafflement or surprise over the last few videos about the fact that there's been lots of talk from the United States about sanctions, but that no sanctions had in fact appeared. Well, they have now appeared, and some of them, in fact all of them, are very predictable, and they take very much the form of what we have been hearing about and reading about in the US media for some time. So there is the expulsion of 10 Russian diplomats. There are the sanctions against various entities in Russia that are said to be involved with the Russian intelligence services. And importantly, there are certain steps taken, sanctions taken concerning Russian sovereign debt. Now, I'm going to come to that later in this program. But for the moment, I'm going to just focus on the inconsistency of this announcement of sanctions a few hours after Biden telephoned Putin, making what appeared to be a conciliatory pitch to Putin, saying that he wanted a predictable relations, or as the Russians put it, a normalization of relations between Russia and the United States, and inviting Putin to a summit meeting over the course of the next few weeks. Then, just a few hours later, shortly after these sanctions were announced, we had briefings by US administration officials and a press conference by Joe Biden himself, in which yet again Biden says, and the officials say, that they seek de-escalation with Russia, that they don't want to take matters further with Russia, that the sanctions are only about the interference, the Russian interference in the 2020 election, of which, by the way, no real substantive evidence has ever been produced, and of alleged Russian involvement in the SolarWinds hack. Again, the United States has provided no evidence that the Russians were involved in that SolarWinds hack. The Russians deny that they were. I'm perfectly prepared to accept that it might have been the Russians, but it seems to me classical espionage of the sort that the United States itself regularly does, and which the Russians, unsurprisingly, do also. Anyway, all these comments from President Biden, from all those US officials, saying that they don't want situation with Russia to get worse. And in fact, one of them is even reported to have said that the United States does not want relations with Russia to fall into a downward spiral. And then, of course, you had President Biden coming along at that press conference and saying that he had, in fact, taken the decision to withdraw the warships, or rather not send the warships into the Black Sea as a de-escalation measure, and again pleading with President Putin not to start an offensive in eastern Ukraine against the Ukrainians. An offensive, by the way, which the Russians have consistently denied they have ever intended. As I have repeatedly said on these programs, the evidence overwhelmingly points to the Russian deployments on Ukraine's eastern border being a response to the deployments by the Ukrainians on the contact line, those deployments by the Ukrainians having begun several weeks before and having been extensively discussed and talked about in Ukrainian and Russian social media and in the Ukrainian and Russian media as well. So, where are we? What explains all of this? Well, I have to say that the Russians are absolutely livid about what has happened. Biden said in his press conference that he informed Putin that sanctions were coming. Perhaps he did, perhaps he didn't. But the fact of the matter is that the readouts by the White House and the Kremlin clearly indicate that the mood in that call was conciliatory. The Russians said shortly afterwards, this came directly from the Kremlin itself, from Dmitry Peskov, the Vladimir Putin's spokesman, that if the United States did proceed with sanctions after that call, there would be a divergence between US words and US actions. And sure enough, those sanctions have come, and Peskov will no doubt say that the sanctions confirm that there is a divergence between US words, which talk about predictability and stability and a normalization of relations and an invitation to a summit, and US actions which involve further sanctions. And it's not difficult to understand why the Russians would respond in this way. Because from their point of view, and it's always important to look at things from their point of view, this call from Biden must, on the face of it, seem an extraordinarily dishonest and double-faced step. On the one hand, he calls Putin and tells Putin, we want to be, if not exactly friends with you, at least to put relations with you on an even keel. And then within a few hours, he announces sanctions against Russia, which straightforwardly appear to contradict that. And it's not surprising that the Russians are now extremely angry. They have made it perfectly clear that they're not interested now in a summit meeting and that they're going to take reciprocal steps. We don't yet know what they are, but I'm going to make a few speculations shortly. And that, frankly, they are not just unimpressed, but extremely angry about what has happened. And if the US or the Biden administration were really acting in a functional way, this should not surprise them. Now, let's take a step back and think this through. If the United States had wanted to impose sanctions on Russia and then had announced those sanctions and then waited for a few weeks for those sanctions to have whatever effect they did have, and then Biden had telephoned Putin and had said, well, let's draw a line under all of this. Let's talk and meet in a third country and have a summit and resolve all our differences. Well, that would have been a perfectly conventional way of conducting diplomacy. Instead, the United States, the Biden-Harris administration, did the diametric opposite. First, they telephone Putin and tell the Russians they want a stable relationship and a meeting, a summit meeting in some third country in which they will, work on sorting out all their various differences. And then, after having taken that step, they reverse themselves suddenly and they announce the sanctions. And it's not surprising, and any government in Washington that really was communicating properly with itself would realize the fact that the impact of this strange mode of behavior in Moscow has been extremely bad indeed. Not to put it too simply, the Russians feel they've been played. And as I said, they are extremely angry, and they are in effect ruling a summit meeting out. And they're talking about retaliatory steps, which, as I said, I'm going to discuss in a moment. So what explains all of this? Well, I think the first thing to say is that it's clear that these sanctions have been in preparation for some time. I mean, these sanctions are not connected, for example, to the situation in Ukraine, or at least not directly. But there may be an indirect connection, but I'm going to explain shortly what I think that is. Briefly, the United States, or at least the Biden-Harris administration, has been talking about these sanctions from ever since it took office. You've been reading the US media, you will find that there's been talk about sanctioning all sorts of Russian officials, all sorts of Russian business entities, whilst this idea of imposing sanctions on Russian debt has been around for a very long time, ever since 2016, by the way, and was being revived last autumn by various Democratic senators, and has been taken forward, obviously, by the Biden administration, as was predicted in commentaries in places like Bloomberg and other places like that. So those sanctions were in preparation for a long time. And it has to be said that the decision, as I've already pointed out, to deploy the two warships to the Black Sea was also something that must have been prepared for a long time. I mean, these two warships obviously have to be deployed to the Mediterranean. Well, there's always US warships in the Mediterranean, but there is a long notice period under the Montreux Convention, which the United States must give to Turkey before it can send its warships into the Black Sea via the Bosphorus. Now, what I suspect has happened is this. I think that there was clearly discussions at some level within the administration about a Ukrainian military deployment to the contact line. And I think those warships, those two warships, were going to be sent to the Black Sea in order to support those two Ukrainian deployments. I'm not suggesting that the US, those two warships, would have been directly involved in the fighting, but they would have provided a show of support, and they would no doubt also have provided Ukraine with a certain amount of intelligence information through the very sophisticated means that they have to carry out surveillance, electronic surveillance and radar surveillance of Russian military movements. And I suspect that the timing of the sanctions is also connected to all of this. I think that the US intended to roll out the sanctions at this time, again in support of Ukraine, with the US threatening that if there was a Russian response to whatever action Ukraine took in the Donbass, the US would respond with more sanctions over and above and on top of the sanctions it would have announced. Now, I say that because if you read Joe Biden's executive order, which has authorized the US, the Treasury Department and the Department of State to impose these sanctions, it's actually quite widely drafted. And it seems to have been drafted in a way that would allow the United States to impose more sanctions very quickly on the Russians in the event that the Russians had responded to any Ukrainian moves in any particular way. Now, I must qualify this because obviously the president is in a position to make executive orders very quickly at any point in time. So simply saying that this executive order authorizes a broader range of sanctions than the ones which have been announced actually, in real terms, says very little. The United States is always in a position to expand its sanctions if an existing executive order doesn't cover whatever sanctions the US has in mind. Well, the president can always sign another executive order. So it seems to me that this particular executive order was drafted, in effect, as a kind of warning. It was done in a very wide way in order to tell the Russians, well, if you take any action in response to whatever move Ukraine is going to take in eastern Ukraine, then we are ready and primed to impose more sanctions upon you. By the way, Joe Biden basically made that very same point in his press conference. So here we have, it seems to me, three moves: a Ukrainian deployment, a sanctions announcement, and a deployment of warships to the Black Sea, all of which look to me, at least so it seems to me, to have been pre-prepared in advance and with their timing coordinated so that they would support each other. Well, that may have been the plan, except I'm speculating here. I mean, I'm not able to say any of this for sure. But then, of course, what happened was something entirely different and completely unexpected, which is that the Russians preempted the Black Sea deployment and preempted the US sanctions announcements by deploying massive military forces to the border and issuing a series of statements saying, in effect, that if the United States wants to impose sanctions, well, they're ready. They can absorb them. Practically saying about sanctions, bring them on. And we see, as a result, all these dissonant and contradictory statements pouring out of Washington. On the one hand, we see various things like the sanctions announcement going ahead. The United States is in no real position, it seems to me, to disregard or to ramp back or dial back that sanctions announcement. It had already been signaled widely in the media. Lots of people were expecting it. It would have invited comment and perhaps criticism if it had not been announced. So they went ahead with it. But at the same time, you have Joe Biden telephoning Putin, asking him to de-escalate the situation in eastern Ukraine, not to launch an offensive, not to crush the Ukrainian army. You have the Ukrainians and the Europeans calling for a ceasefire. You see all sorts of demands and requests from all sorts of people now in the West urgently requesting a ceasefire. And you see the warships that were going to be deployed to the Black Sea turning back. That, it seems to me, is the simplest and most straightforward explanation of what has happened. And in my previous video, I read a commentary from the British newspaper, the Daily Mail, which also in effect said that Britain and the United States were extremely alarmed by the Russian deployments and were very, very worried and wanted to do everything they possibly could, to the extent that they could, to prevent those deployments escalating into an outright conflict in eastern Ukraine, which would result in Ukraine's comprehensive defeat. So there we are. We have a situation where, on the one hand, the US is calling, begging almost, Russia to exercise restraint in eastern Ukraine, and in effect calling on its own Ukrainian allies to do the same, and at the same time the US carrying on with some elements of its plan, specifically its sanctions plan, which had already been prepared in advance. Now, what would have been the objective? I am still not entirely convinced that the Ukrainians ever did actually intend an outright offensive against the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Maybe that was the plan, but I suspect that a limited attack of some kind might have been a more realistic objective. There would have been a fear that to press forward too far might have provoked a Russian reaction, and that clearly was something that Ukraine could not survive and which the United States did not want. I suspect that some people in Washington looked at what happened in the Caucasus last year in the fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan and concluded that if there was a Ukrainian advance in the Donbass, the Russian response would be muted until a point was finally reached when the Ukrainians would make gains and would be able to impose some sort of diplomatic solution to the conflict along the kind of lines that Washington and Kiev and London and Brussels, the places where the hardliners are most actively engaged along the lines that they would have wanted. That's my guess. Obviously, I don't know this for a fact, but it seems to me the most consistent and logical explanation of what might happen. In fact, it's now clear that the Russians are primed and ready to respond to any Ukrainian incursion at all. And that is why we see all of these Russian moves taking place now. The massive deployments of Russian forces and the closing of the seas around Russia and specifically the Sea of Azov, as well as, by the way, the deployment of these aviation assets. Indeed, just shortly before I made this video, I was reading and seeing social media images coming out of Russia, which confirmed that more troops from deep within Russia continue to be deployed to Ukraine's eastern border, and that the Russian deployments are not only not being de-escalated, they're actually increasing in size. So, at that point, the plan, as I said, changed, and we've had instead all of these calls and pleas to Russia to actually hold off, and all these requests, even after the sanctions were imposed, to Russia not to escalate the situation, and all these assurances from the United States that in fact it does seek a peaceful, predictable and stable relationship with Russia, if you like, a normalization of relations. So, a mess, because that's what it is. Because anybody who understood the situation in Ukraine would know that there was absolutely no possibility that the Russians would allow a Ukrainian offensive to gain traction at all. And if there was a plan for such an offensive, it was a huge miscalculation, and the United States now finds itself, as I said, in a difficult position where it has to try to disengage the Ukrainian army from the border, the conflict zone, without it appearing entirely to lose face, which is what all this talk about de-escalation is ultimately about. Because, of course, if Zelensky simply orders Ukraine's troops to withdraw from the border, without a corresponding reduction in Russian troops on the other side, then he is going to be in possibly terminal political trouble in Ukraine. And there is a very real possibility of a massive crisis in Ukraine, which even the United States would struggle to control. So we now have a strange situation where the United States is at one and the same time pursuing two completely contradictory objectives. It's trying to impose sanctions, which won't work, as I'm going to discuss shortly, and at the same time, it's talking for peace. It's calling for peace with Russia on a range of issues. And here I'm going to discuss the sanctions and say a few things about them. The first things to say is that the Russians are completely unfazed by these sanctions, and I'm talking now specifically about the sanctions on their sovereign debt. The sanctions that the US has initiated against Russia's sovereign debt are specifically against US investors who buy Russian ruble bonds in Russia's own financial markets. However, only around 25% of ruble bonds are bought by foreigners, by non-Russians. 75% of them are actually bought by Russians. And the Russian ruble bond market is actually quite small. And in fact, we've had a statement about this from a discussion about this from a Russian businessman, Alexander Murichev, who is the vice president, the executive vice president of the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. And this is what he said. As for the imposition of sanctions against Russian public debt, personally, I do not see any big problems. The debt will become cheaper. This is obvious. Non-residents, he means foreigners, with big losses, will sell our public debt, which will be bought by Russian commercial banks. If there is not enough liquidity on the part of the banks, the central bank will support commercial banks with resources. In other words, all that will happen is that more the Russian ruble bonds will simply be bought mainly by Russian banks and business people, given that the vast majority of them already are. The Russian financial system will have no difficulty at all absorbing them. So this is not going to make any significant difference. Now, here it's important to say that there's been an absolute sea change in the way that the Russian financial system operates. 10 years ago, there were no Russian ruble bonds to speak of at all. Ruble bonds, I should explain, are commercial debt that the Russian government issues to lenders in order to finance its operations. The Russian government doesn't actually need to do this on any very great scale because it has only minimal debt and normally runs a surplus on its budget. It has been doing it. It has been selling debt on its domestic financial market, not in order to finance its budget and to cover its own costs. It is doing it in order to strengthen its own financial market. It wants more Russian banks and more Russian business people, and indeed Russian investors, to buy Russian debt, because they can then use that debt which they hold as an asset which they can then leverage in order to undertake more high-risk investment in the Russian economy. All governments do this to a greater or lesser extent. They do it because government debt is considered to be low risk and therefore a safe investment, and investors who have hold a certain amount of government debt are then assumed to be more willing to invest in a more high-risk way in the economy as a whole. Russia was not in a position to do that 10 or so years ago because its financial markets were at that time extremely undeveloped. And if Russia had tried to issue, the Russian government had tried to issue ruble bonds at that time, there would have been very few takers, even within Russia itself. Even today, the Russian ruble bond market is relatively small, but it has been growing in size rapidly. It is focused on internal investors and internal Russian financial institutions, and it has been growing rapidly, and it will continue to do so. And as Alexander Murichev said, these sanctions by the US are not going to affect it in any significant way at all. A far more effective, or rather powerful sanctions, and the sanctions which the US conspicuously did not take, would have been those which have been discussed at various times, which is to disconnect Russian banks from the SWIFT interbank payment system and to stop payment services by Visa and MasterCard in Russia and amongst Russian holders. But here again, the situation has been radically changing. And I'm going to again discuss certain comments that were made by Olga Skorobogatova, who is the first deputy governor of Russia's central bank. And this is what she said. If this is what she said just the other day about the situation with SWIFT and a disconnection from Visa and MasterCard. If we are talking about this current situation, then I believe that it is rather calm and steady. We do not see any risks in disconnecting from the international payment systems. I think that the international payment systems would find it to be extremely unfavorable. Our locomotive is not simply standing on an emergency side track. It is actively traveling, meaning that we have the national payment card system, which is operating superbly and covers matters of card transactions in Russia. And there are already 13 countries that accept the Mir card. The Mir card and the national payment card system is an alternative to Visa and MasterCard, which Russia launched domestically some years ago. And Skorobogatova says that it is working superbly and that the Mir card is now being accepted in as many as 13 other countries. Then she goes on to say this: we have a financial messaging system that also processes the traffic of financial messages within Russia, and there are not any restrictions on performance. We have a system of fast payments that forms a second alternative channel in addition to using cards for payment. In other words, Russia has its own payment infrastructure. It has its own alternative to SWIFT. It has its own alternative to Visa and MasterCard. It doesn't need Visa and MasterCard, and it doesn't need SWIFT in order to continue to conduct operations in Russia. And then she goes on to say the following: I believe that we need to continue our operations specifically to develop our payment systems and our infrastructure platforms, though at the same time, as I have noted, it is extremely important for us to maintain a competitive environment. We would like Russian companies to develop in a competitive environment and to earn their reputation and win their successes precisely by being the best and not having any special preferences. Then she went on to say that because of the sanctions in 2014, the payment market in Russia ran into an extremely difficult and unpleasant situation when several banks were disconnected from the international payment systems, thereby forcing the creation of the NPCS, the National Payment Card System, with its Mercard and its alternative to SWIFT, in very short order. So the Russians feel confident that if they are in fact disconnected from SWIFT and MasterCard, they can deal with that very quickly, and it will not disrupt their domestic economy to any very great extent. Now, there will be consequences. Western companies that are invested in Russia will find it much more difficult to withdraw funding from Russia, though very soon, probably next year, a Russian digital currency, a Russian digital ruble will appear, like the digital Chinese RMB, which I discussed recently in another video, which ought to make it possible for transfers of currency to take place from Russia to foreign countries without the need to use SWIFT and without the need to use payment systems either. But having said that, in the short term, that would be extremely disruptive, and foreign companies invested in Russia would undoubtedly run into difficulties. So would Russian exporters, but here perhaps the problem would be less, because Russian exporters, being state corporations, would be able to receive payments in good time, and would be able, in the meantime, until they receive those payments, to cover their expenses out of their vast resources that they have accumulated, with the knowledge that they have the Russian government and the Russian central bank behind them. Perhaps the greatest problem would be for Russian tourists and Russian visitors abroad. Most countries around the world, of course, don't yet accept the Mercard, though Skoro Bogatova says that 13 countries now do. Having said that, I suspect that some countries, Turkey for example, which are very dependent on Russian tourism, would probably adopt the link up to the Mercard system fairly quickly, if only in order to maintain that tourist flow from Russia and to maintain that business from Russia. So I suspect that the Russians, even if they had some problems in the interim, would probably find ways round fairly quickly and fairly soon. Moreover, it's not as if this is completely unknown in the West. There was a remarkable article in the Financial Times, which appeared by Ruchir Sharkha, which appeared back in March, which makes some actually remarkably interesting and insightful comments about the state of the Russian economy and about the way it's been organized. And these are the sort of things he says. And I, again, stress, I'm quoting directly from the Financial Times. Though he is often compared with erratic autocrats, Putin has long been relatively careful on macroeconomic policy. After 2014, he turned even more defensive and focused on turning Russia into a financial fortress invulnerable to external pressure, including sanctions. To a surprising extent, he has succeeded. Once amongst the most crisis-prone emerging nations, Russia is now one of the most conservative and stable, whilst peers like Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan grow increasingly unorthodox on economic policy. Putin has become a model of orthodoxy. The pillars of Fortress Russia lie in how the Kremlin manages its budget and the ruble. When the pandemic started to force economic lockdowns last year, Russia was ready. It entered the crisis with the lowest government debt amongst the 20 largest emerging economies, just 14% of gross domestic product. It also had the highest government surplus, the fourth highest current account surplus, and the fourth largest foreign currency reserves, some $580 billion, up from a 2015 low of $350 billion. 7 years of hawkish monetary policy to control inflation had left the central bank with room to cut rates. For the first time in modern history, Russia had the wherewithal to counter a crisis. He is referring to the crisis of 2020 connected with the pandemic, by raising government spending and easing interest rates. Yet its leaders continued to move deliberately. In 2020, its central bank and government stimulus was moderate compared with other big emerging economies. So too was the resulting downturn, a contraction of around 3.5%. He's overstating it. It's more likely around 3%. Today Russia is less vulnerable to outside pressure than in 2014. The debt its government and private borrowers owe to foreigners is low, and the resources they have to cover those debts, whether from export revenues or in foreign reserves, is high. For example, Russia's short-term foreign debts amount to barely 10% of its foreign currency reserves, compared with an average of over 30% in emerging countries. Russia is also less beholden to the global oil market. The government stores excess profits when prices are high and spends them when prices are low, stabilizing the economy and the ruble. Today, the ruble is less prone to swing with oil prices than the currencies of developed energy exporters like Canada and Norway. Finally, the Kremlin is making import substitution work. It countered international sanctions by blocking food imports, which has invigorated Russian agriculture and reduced dependence on foreign suppliers. Along with China, Russia is one of the few countries to nurture domestic internet giants behind increasingly closed doors to protect them from Western competition. And then he makes the usual comments about corruption and low growth, which I will discuss in another program. To my mind, those have little force. And in fact, they're then contradicted by these words, which show that he does in fact realize that they have little force. Despite falling living standards and exposés of state corruption, polls suggest more Russians think the country is moving in the right direction than the wrong one. A crisis-scarred nation seems to prize stability. As it happens, Fortress Russia is well built to survive a post-pandemic world of greater deglobalization and local digitization. With the global economy facing the threats of slower growth, higher inflation, and frothy markets, domestic strength is a key advantage. Of course, the stated intention of sanctions is to target the Kremlin and its allies, not to punish the Russian people. But 7 years of sanctions have already hardened the Kremlin against outside pressure. That will mean it will take more than just ratcheting up targeted sanctions to dent the walls of Fortress Russia. Well, he is, of course, absolutely right. And in fact, if you follow my articles in the Duran, the articles I used to write before the Duran became a channel, you will find that I have discussed this many times and in many places. The whole sanctions idea on Russia is based on a complete misconception and a belief which is still prevalent and still extraordinarily prevalent amongst many people, that this is a gas station rather than a country, that it is a declining power rather than a resurgent one, and that its economy is dependent on oil and gas. None of that is true. Moreover, and in addition, further proof of that is shown by the response of Russian markets to the latest sanctions against Russian sovereign debt, which Biden announced. The ruble only dipped very slightly over the course of the day and then quickly recovered all its gains. And the same was true of all the other Russian financial markets also. They shrugged and absorbed the sanctions and moved on. These sanctions are ineffectual. All they have done is they have ruined the atmosphere created by Biden's call, and have made the Russians decide that a agreement, a summit meeting with Biden has no possible purpose. In fact, the Kremlin has said that the whole idea of a summit is now off. Biden, in his press conference, continued to plead for one, but the Russians, it seems, are no longer interested. What are the conclusions to be drawn from this strange affair? Firstly, the one that I said, the United States, the Biden-Harris administration, seems to be bitterly divided and dysfunctional. There are some people like William Burns, the new CIA director, that seem to have some understanding that it's necessary to speak with the Russians, if only to pursue stability with the Russians and to make a more predictable situation in Europe. There are others, I suspect, primarily in the US Navy, that want to focus not on Russia so much, but on the emerging challenge or threat that they perceive from China. And of course, the US ground forces probably pale at the thought of getting involved in a hot war with the Russians in Ukraine, of all places. But at the same time, Biden cannot overcome the enormous pressures from the neocons, from much of the Democratic Party, fed for years now with Russophobic stories of Russiagate, of the Russians helping Donald Trump to win the 2016 election, of the Russians meddling in US politics, of the Russians paying bounties to the Taliban to kill American soldiers. A story which, by the way, over the course of the day, the US actually admitted is unsubstantiated. Biden simply finds it impossible to face these people down. So you have this strange policy of hot, cold, attempts to impose sanctions, talk about sending the fleet to the Black Sea, support for Ukraine, and perhaps strategizing with Ukraine to try to force a solution to the problem of the Donbass, and then sudden reversals, retreats, pleas from Russia to Russia for restraint, attempts to talk about de-escalating the situation, talk about the need to avoid a downward spiral. It's an administration that is totally discordant and doesn't know what direction to take. The Russians, for their part, I am sure, have concluded that there is really little point in working with the United States at present. Their ambassador, whom they recalled from Washington, is most unlikely to return there anytime soon. And they're going to take these sanctions, as I said, very angrily, not because they have any significant effect on them in themselves, but because they see these sanctions as an extremely aggressive move, and because they are infuriated by the way in which Biden sweet talks them one day and hits them the next. So what are they going to do? Well, in the short term, I think they're going to do the obvious things. They're going to expel American diplomats, impose sanctions on their own on American officials and companies. None of that will have any very great significance. Obviously, Russian sanctions on US debt and all that are not going to have any effect at all. I think in the longer term, they may be planning to do something else. And that I think is something that people in the United States may not realize and may not be prepared for. There's been, as we've discussed in this program, talk in the United States about disconnecting Russia from SWIFT, disconnecting Russia from the Visa and MasterCard payment systems. I wonder if before very long the Russians decide to do that themselves. After all, as Russian Central Bank First Deputy Governor Olga Skorobogatova said, they're in a perfectly good position to absorb it. And of course, next year, the digital ruble is coming. It may very well be that the Russians decide that there is really no point in sticking with Visa and MasterCard and SWIFT, if only because that gives the United States some perceived leverage over them, even if that leverage is in reality completely ineffective. So I can very easily see how, perhaps not immediately, but say in a year or two, or perhaps a little longer, the Russians suddenly turn around and say that they're disconnecting from SWIFT, that they're going to use their own interbank payment system from that point on for transactions within Russia, that they're going to use their digital currency for payments with businesses that trade with them from outside Russia, and that they will in future use their digital currency and their mere payment card in substitution for Visa and MasterCard. That would, I think, be a profound shock to the United States, and it would once and for all confirm that the whole idea of sanctions has failed and has come to an end. It would be the final liberation, if you will, of the Russian economy from its role in the Western financial and economic system, which is part of the process of globalization. It joined in the 1990s, but which, as we have seen over the course of this program, it is now steadily detaching itself from. Thank you for joining me for this long, intricate, and complex video on this difficult subject. I look forward to you joining me for future videos, both on this channel and on other channels. Our main channel, the Duran, where I do videos with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. And also, please check out his channel. You will find links under this video. Please also check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey. And also, please support us to the extent that you can through Patreon, PayPal, and Subscribestar. And by the way, we accept payments and donations in all currencies, including the new ones. Last but not least, please check out our shop and join us on our Discord server. You'll find all sorts of wonderful things in our shop. Our famous magic mugs, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hoodies, our hats, and all the rest. And remember, you support us and make it possible for us to give you the kind of analysis that we give in our programs by supporting us through these different means. And please also remember too to subscribe to this channel if you want to continue to receive this service. Thank you very much for joining me for this program, and I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and in our other platforms, and have a wonderful day.